This episode is brought to you in part by funding from Carl Thacker, a generous Patreon supporter. For more information on the Patreon campaign, please stay tuned to the end of the episode.
Carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old.
There was no time to waste. Fall was coming. Winter would quickly follow. The fort had to be repaired and then strengthened. Supply buildings and the storehouse still had to be rebuilt. Martial law had to be reimposed. The colony had to survive, sure, for the colony's sake, but this time John Smith's name was on the line. But Newport's arrival hindered progress. Smith's plans were working well. He had overseen much productivity in his early presidency. Buildings were indeed repaired, and preparations for future trade missions were made. Non-essential buildings like Ratcliffe's hated palace in the woods were forsaken. The focus was now firmly on survival. Survival the way that John Smith had understood. George Percy embarked on a trade mission during this time, while Smith directed military drills next to the redesigned, now five-sided 1608 James Fort. It was also during this time that Christopher Newport's second supply mission arrived. Smith was not excited to receive this mission, not because more supplies were being brought, but because he'd have to submit his newly acquired position under Christopher Newport's command. Newport's ship, the Mary Margaret, brought 70 fresh settlers, 25 of whom ranked as gentlemen, another annoyance to John Smith. Two of those gentlemen were Francis West, Thomas West, Lord Delaware's 22-year-old brother, and Thomas Forrest, a potential murder suspect. Forrest had other nefarious English connections potentially linking him to a Catholic plot that, interestingly enough, implicated John Ratcliffe. But Forrest would make Virginia history in another first. He was responsible for bringing the colony's first women, his wife, who history records just as Mrs. Forrest, and his wife's 14-year-old maid, Anne Burris. The woman-starved men wasted no time, apparently, as Anne married John Layden about a month after disembarking the Mary Margaret in what would become Virginia's first wedding. Other notable newcomers were Richard Waldo and Peter Wynne, who Smith believed were chosen by the Royal Council to pad the now-depleted Settlement Council. It seemed to Smith that Wynne was a direct replacement for the shot-dead George Kendall. Smith was right. Robert Cecil used Wynne as a spy during the gunpowder plot. This came about because Wynne served under a William Stanley during the Dutch War with Spain. During the course of events, Stanley defected to the Spanish side, and Wynne apparently followed, a treasonable offense in Protestant England. But Wynne was spared by Robert Cecil after Wynne submitted to being used as Cecil's pawn. Needless to say, a Catholic element was starting to be felt in Jamestown, and John Smith was unnerved by it all. A group of Poles and Germans also trekked across the Atlantic. Their purpose was to make tar, soap ash, and pitch, commodities that were greatly desired in England at the time. They were part of a backup plan to make Virginia profitable if gold or a Northwest Passage were not found. Newport, for his part, was determined to find that elusive gold and equally as elusive passage, and this is where tension between he and Smith erupted into open conflict.
Seldom get attention as a pacifist. Papers only print what shows the color green. There's things we need to see that people haven't seen. I've seen 1,000 people as they march along, with every soul united in a single song. The smoke inside their voices seem to shake the ground. Even so, it's not enough of them to burn it down. We want more than smoke. We want the fire. We want the fire.
Smith had no time for gold or passages. He had done more than enough exploration throughout the region to know that neither gold nor a passage existed. Now was the time to ensure that the colony had enough to survive a winter, not chase after folly. But Newport didn't care what Smith had to say. His bottom line was that the colony would find gold, or it would make enough goods worth 2,000 pounds to load the Mary Margaret and pay for a return voyage. Basically, the English were transferring their Irish plantation policies to the New World, and Smith loudly thought the commands insane. An impasse was reached, and the situation had to be settled. The final decision was put to a council vote, but the additions of Wynne, Waldo, and the restored by Newport John Ratcliffe provided enough support to overrule John Smith. Even Matthew Scribner, Smith's closest ally, voted against the newly chosen president. Tensions worsened further after the council vote when Newport stated his intention to coronate Powhatan in an English-style ceremony. Smith openly guffawed, at which point Newport claimed that Smith's claims for food and provisions was just his way to hinder Newport so Smith could effect the coronation himself. Further, Newport believed that Smith was actively trying to cover his violent tracks with his refusal. Smith, fuming at these allegations, said that he'd invite Powhatan himself to Jamestown. He took 4 men, as well as the newly returned from England Namontack, across the peninsula over the Pamunkey River to Werowocomoco, where Pocahontas greeted the small party by telling them that her father was not present. He was away hunting. In the meantime, Pocahontas extended her hospitality by offering places around the fire, at which point the men heard a hideous noise and shrieking from the forest. Pocahontas calmed the frightened men by offering her life in return if any harm came to the men. They then witnessed 30 painted Indian women open a feast by dancing with swords, bows, and arrows. The women then took Smith into a private location and apparently pressed their naked bodies on him while offering themselves to the captain. Smith says he refused, and a proper Indian feast began once he emerged. After the feast, the men stayed the night at the capital and were greeted by the newly arrived Powhatan the next morning.
Issues buried deeply always reappear. When they're only skin deep, they come back each year. Resolution only happens when there's sacrifice. As it's missing time and time again, we paid the price, we want more.
Smith and Powhatan wasted little time in getting down to business. Smith invited Powhatan to come to Jamestown to greet his father Newport. Newport, Smith said, wanted to bestow presents and formalize a pact against the Monacans. But Powhatan saw through the gesture, and Smith would suffer for it. Powhatan began reminding the English president that he was a king, and that this was his land. He would not go to Newport. Newport would come to him. "I'll stay here for 8 days to receive these gifts, but I will not go to your fort," he said. "Further, I don't need your help fighting the Monacans. I can handle my own affairs just fine. Finally, as for your hoped-for passage to the Pacific, there is none. My people lied." Smith must have known that this would be the reply that he would receive, but it still stunned him. He must have felt that he was losing control both at Jamestown and Werowocomoco, but he had to prove himself right to the English by suffering reproach. Smith's suffering must have impressed reality upon Newport, because Newport deigned to sail to Werowocomoco the day after Smith returned to Jamestown. But Newport still thought of Powhatan as a lesser being. Either way, he sent a barge with Powhatan's gifts, a basin, a ewer, bed, and furniture, ahead of his 50-man group. Upon arrival, Newport unloaded the barge and then began offering the smaller gifts that he brought with him. First, a scarlet cloak was given to Powhatan, who had to be reassured that the mantle would not hurt him. Then a comical situation unfolded when Newport asked Powhatan to kneel down in order to receive the crown that King James had sent. But Powhatan would not kneel, and because he was quite a bit taller than Newport and his men, they could not place the crown on Powhatan's head. Newport, who only had one arm, had to have his men lean on the chief in order to bring him low enough for Newport to crown the proud Indian leader. Immediately following the farcical coronation, an Englishman fired his pistol, which alerted the men aboard one of the barges to fire off cannons in a salute. This act frightened Powhatan, who jumped and had to regain his composure. Once regained, he engaged Newport in deliberations. Newport wanted to go into Monacan territory. Powhatan replied that he would not help the English and then attempted to halt the English advance. Newport was unnerved by all of this and had no choice but to leave the supposedly newly crowned English vassal. Pleasantries were hastily exchanged, in which the English were given approximately 7 bushels of corn to take back to Jamestown. Smith's overtures, therefore, were vindicated.
We want more than
But Newport undertook his expedition anyway. He set off to go beyond the falls near present-day Richmond with 120 men, including Waldo, Wynne, and Scrivener. This left Smith in sole command at Jamestown, but he still had to accomplish what Newport had wanted. Thus the remaining 80 or so men set about collecting raw materials to load the Mary Margaret. Smith, for his part, sailed down the James River in order to gather wood for the desired clapboard and wainscoting. The men accompanying Smith were an interesting mixture of seasoned and unseasoned laborers. There were those who enjoyed felling trees, and there were those who enjoyed cursing each time their axe blade landed a blow. Smith grew tired of the cursing and devised a method to punish profanity. He would count the number of curses emitted by each individual and then pour that many cans of water over the offender at the end of each day's work. A sort of colonial version of waterboarding, perhaps? Either way, Smith's leadership apparently worked. He claimed that his 30 to 40 men could do more work voluntarily than 100 of the rest could by compulsion. An interesting historical dig at socialistic ideals. Smith further thought that 20 hired men could do the work of the 30 to 40 men even better, because they were working for their own profit, not the profit of others. Smith collected enough wood and then left for another journey, this time to collect the needed supplies that were so crucial for survival. He sailed to the site of his capture from almost a year ago and demanded the Chickahominy Indians to supply corn. They refused, and Smith attacked, yes, as he said, with some vengeance in mind. He squeezed about 100 bushels out of the beaten tribe before moving on to Werowocomoco, where 4 hogsheads of corn were handed over by Namontack. By this time, however, Smith thought that the Indians were conspiring to starve the Englishmen, yet he was mistaken with this assumption. The Indians really didn't have much to offer. Drought had destroyed their crops for a third year in a row, leaving them with little, certainly not enough to feed the English. Meanwhile, Newport's venture 50 miles past the falls appeared to be a success. They met the Monacans, who received them neutrally. They discovered sweet water, healthy air, and potentially silver. Or they were lying. John Smith thought the claims to be at least exaggerated, and he made it a point to say as much in his report back to the Virginia Company. Smith blasted the company's expectations as well as their personnel choices. Both were unrealistic and unfair. The colony shouldn't be forced to foot the extravagant bill of Newport and his men. Besides, the men are plundering the supplies and inflating sale prices for their own benefit at the expense of the colony. Because of these issues, factions would continue to tear apart the colony. If they chose to continue their policies, then they must not look for any profitable returns. Yet Smith offered not only criticism, he also offered advice. He said that the colony did have abundance, even if it weren't the type of wealth being sought after. To harness that abundance, the colony must send skilled workers and then be realistic about the profits, which would come in time. Carpenters, blacksmiths, glassmakers, fishermen, gardeners, and the like would make real wealth that would not have to survive one supply ship to another. His letter missed the mark, though he wouldn't know that until a few months later. But Smith did include an extremely useful map that detailed his explorations to that point in November 1608. The company looked at that map and thought Virginia could still make a profit, though perhaps not in the same vein as Smith was thinking. Newport took the loaded provisions and correspondence with him and sailed away in December 1608. He was a failure. After 3 tries, he never found gold, the lost colonists, or a Northwest Passage. Smith would be vindicated in that Newport's command was stripped as a result. Though Newport returned to Virginia, miraculously, as will be seen, Newport was never in command again. Smith, however, would also lose command. His letter was not well received in London, but his map was. Because of these 2 documents, as well as some of the other letters sent back to England in 1608, the Virginia Company set about restructuring their venture, largely under royal influence. Instead of a council, a governor would be chosen. Therefore, Smith was out of a job, though he wouldn't know that for another 9 months. Until then, Smith regained control and began running the tattered colony better than could be expected. At least that is how Smith portrays it, and we have little to go by for disagreement. Thank you for your continued support of the Virginia History Podcast. If you like what is being produced, please subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher or your favorite podcast provider. Like us on Facebook, and visit the website at vahistorypodcast.com. Please, share the program as well as rating the podcast on iTunes and offering any feedback you may have. In addition to those options, I've undertaken a Patreon campaign in order to fund future research and episodes. Please visit the campaign at patreon.com/VAHistPod. One can also find a link under the support tab on the website. Thank you to those who have provided me with valuable comments. They are greatly appreciated. Join me next time as we continue looking into Smith's leadership and how Jamestown was affected by it.
Oh, Baba, do do ba do des bi di do do ze